There I was, standing rather awkwardly in the doorway of St. Luke's, watching my family conduct what I can only describe as a rather premature celebration of my demise. My son Mark was delivering what I suppose he thought was a touching eulogy, whilst his wife Kristen dabbed at her eyes with theatrical precision, the sort of performance that wouldn't have fooled a particularly gullible pantomime audience. They were divvying up the spoils of my life's work like carrion crows at a roadside picnic, seemingly delighted that the old fellow had finally shuffled off this mortal coil. The only trouble was, I was very much alive and feeling rather put out about the whole affair. So I cleared my throat, perhaps a touch more dramatically than strictly necessary, and announced to the assembled mourners, "You're celebrating a tad early, aren't you?" Well, you should have seen their faces. White as freshly laundered bedsheets, the lot of them, as if they'd seen a ghost, which I suppose, from their perspective, they rather had. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now, because nothing says family bonding quite like crowdsourcing your global audience, whilst your offspring plots your demise. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Let me start from the beginning, when consciousness first crept back into my addled brain like a cat bagler with particularly poor timing. The first sensation that greeted my return to the land of the living was pain, a dull, persistent ache radiating from my chest as though someone had parked a particularly hefty lorry on my ribcage and forgotten where they'd left the keys. My eyelids felt as though they'd been weighted down with old pennies, and when I finally managed to pry them open, the world swam into focus with all the clarity of a particularly murky fish pond. The steady beeping that pierced through the fog in my head was matched by the rhythmic hum of various machines, the sort of mechanical orchestra that plays exclusively in hospitals and nowhere else. Thank goodness. I found myself tangled in a web of tubes and wires like some sort of medical Christmas decoration, with a plastic four-line biting into my arm with all the tenderness of a particularly vindictive mosquito. The air carried that distinctive hospital perfume, sharp disinfectant with undertones of existential dread, that stings the nostrils and makes one long for the simple pleasure of fresh air. I attempted to move my fingers, but they responded with all the enthusiasm of dying fish flopping about on a dock, which was rather less encouraging than one might hope. Where on earth was I? More to the point, what had happened? I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead, the sort that makes everyone look as though they're auditioning for a role in a zombie film. A crack snaked across the ceiling like a jagged lightning bolt frozen in time, which struck me as rather poetic, though I wasn't entirely sure why. My throat felt as though I'd been gargling with sandpaper, my tongue a useless lump of leather. I wanted to call out, but all I managed was a sound that wouldn't have impressed a particularly undemanding bullfrog. That's when I heard the quick, soft footsteps approaching, and a woman's face appeared above me. She had kind brown eyes, graying hair tucked into a sensible bun, and wore a nurse's badge that proclaimed her to be Janet, though she struck me as more of a Margaret, if I'm being honest. "Mr. Turner," she exclaimed, her voice bright with the sort of surprise usually reserved for unexpected lottery wins or finding a decent cup of tea at a motorway service station. "Oh my goodness, you're awake. It's a miracle, truly miraculous." She bustled away before I could respond, if croaking like a distressed toad can be considered a response, her sensible shoes squeaking on the linoleum with the enthusiasm of a rubber duck convention. A miracle, she'd called it. Well, I didn't feel particularly miraculous. I felt rather like I'd been thoroughly chewed up and spat out by something with exceptionally poor table manners. Fragments of memory began to flicker like a faulty film reel. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the blinding flash of headlights. An accident, clearly. I'd been driving home from the office, hadn't I? The details slipped away like water through cupped hands, which was rather frustrating. I shifted position, a mistake that sent pain shooting through my ribs like an overly enthusiastic acupuncturist, and my gaze drifted to the room's door. Heavy, beige, and firmly shut. It felt like a barrier between me and the world beyond, though I wasn't entirely sure which side was the prison and which was freedom. Janet returned with a gentleman in a white coat, his spectacles perched on a nose that looked as though it had been designed by someone with a particular fondness for angles. "Dr. Clark," he introduced himself, his voice carrying that clipped precision that suggests either medical training or particularly rigorous upbringing in the home counties. He conducted the usual medical theater, checking monitors, scribbling on charts, asking questions that seemed designed to determine whether my brain had turned to porridge during my extended absence. "Name, Ronald Turner," Age, 62. Did I know what year it was? I hazarded a guess at 2025, which earned me a satisfied nod, though I suspected he'd have been equally pleased if I had said 1843. My head throbbed with the persistence of a particularly determined woodpecker, but I forced myself to focus. How long? I managed to croak, my voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony. How long was I out? Dr. Clark hesitated, glancing at Janet with the sort of look usually exchanged between diplomats discussing a particularly delicate international incident. She stepped closer, her smile softening into something resembling genuine sympathy. 2 months, Mr. Turner, she said carefully, her tone gentle enough to handle bone china. You were in a coma after the accident. We weren't entirely sure you'd pull through. 2 months. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus. 2 months of my life, gone, vanished into the ether like morning mist. I swallowed hard, my throat protesting. My family, I began, but couldn't quite finish the question. Didn't need to, really. Janet's smile faltered like a candle in a draught, and she busied herself with my foreline, avoiding eye contact with the sort of determination usually reserved for not looking at car crashes. They've been informed, she said carefully, her tone carrying all the warmth of a particularly polite rejection letter. I'm sure they'll be here soon now that you're awake. Informed, she'd said. Not visiting. Not maintaining a vigil at my bedside. Merely informed, like one might inform the postman of a change of address. My chest tightened, and it wasn't entirely due to the pain in my ribs. Mark, my son, my only child, I'd given him everything. His first car, his university education, a position at my company when his grand plans had rather spectacularly gone pear-shaped. And Kristen, his wife, always smiling that calculated smile that never quite reached her eyes but was sharp enough to cut glass. Where were they? I gripped the bedsheet, my knuckles whitening. The door loomed in my peripheral vision, silent and unmoving. No one was coming through it. Were they? The taxi jutted to a stop with all the grace of a dying walrus, and I handed the driver a crumpled 20, my hands trembling from the effort of performing such a simple task. My legs wobbled as I stepped onto the curb, rather like a newborn giraffe attempting ballet, whilst the spring air of Hartford filled my lungs with a mixture of pollen and possibility. My house stood before me, a 2-story colonial affair with red brick and white trim, the sort of place I'd built for a family that no longer seemed particularly concerned with my continued existence. The lawn had gone rather wild in my absence, dandelions staging what appeared to be a successful coup against the grass, whilst the mailbox sagged under the weight of envelopes that spilled out like forgotten secrets. 2 months, and no one had bothered to check. One might think that family members would occasionally pop round to ensure the place hadn't been claimed by squatters or turned into an impromptu nature reserve, but apparently not. I clutched my pathetic plastic bag of belongings, wallet, keys, and that cracked watch that had stopped keeping time somewhere between the accident and my resurrection, and shuffled toward the porch. Each step sent jolts of pain through my knees, rather pointed reminders of the toll my extended nap had taken. The air smelled of lilacs from the neighbor's garden, sweet and mocking against the neglect of my own little corner of England, or rather, Hartford, but the principle remained the same. I fumbled with the keys, the lock protesting with the stiffness that comes from disuse, rather like my joints. The door creaked open with a low groan that echoed through the empty foyer, and I was greeted by the sight of dust coating the oak table where we used to share Sunday dinners in more optimistic times. A faint whiff of damp wood hung in the air, and I noticed Rusty's bowl in the corner, empty and dry as a politician's promise. Where was my cat? Had Mark even remembered to feed him? Or was poor Rusty now residing in that great cattery in the sky? I set my bag down, my chest tight with something that had nothing to do with medical complications and everything to do with the weight of abandonment. The living room was untouched, the sofa cushion still bearing the impression from my last nap before the accident, a ghostly reminder of simpler times. But the silence was wrong, heavy and oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I was about to venture upstairs when a sharp gasp from across the street snapped me back to reality. There stood a figure on her lawn, frozen like a statue in a particularly dramatic garden. Marjorie, my neighbor for the better part of 2 decades, staring at me as though I were the star of a particularly convincing magic show. Her hand clutched her chest, and she took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling like autumn leaves. Ronald Turner, you're alive. I frowned, stepping onto the porch. The grass crunched under my shoes with the satisfying sound of vegetation that had given up trying to maintain appearances. "Marge," I called back. "What's wrong?" "Of course I'm alive." My voice sounded hoarse and unused, like a neglected instrument. She shook her head, her eyes wide as saucers. "But they said you were dead. They are holding your memorial right now at St. Luke's." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. Memorial? My memorial? What sort of fresh nonsense was this? Memorial? I demanded, my voice rather sharper than intended. "Who exactly is they?" Marjorie wrung her hands, her scarf slipping to her shoulder like a surrendering flag. "Mark, your son, and Kristen. They organized it. Said you didn't make it after the accident." She hesitated, her gaze darting away like a guilty child. "Everyone's there, Ronald. The whole town." The world tilted on its axis. Mark and Kristen, my own flesh and blood and the woman who'd married into it, telling the world I was dead. I gripped the porch railing, my knuckles white as fresh snow. The spring breeze felt suddenly cold, cutting through my thin hospital shirt like accusations through a courtroom. "They said I was dead," I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. Marjorie nodded, her lips trembling. "I'm so sorry, Ronald. I thought, we all thought." She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes like regret made liquid. I turned away, my gaze locking onto the house, my life, left to rot whilst they played their little game. I thought of Mark, his lazy grin whenever he'd asked for just one more loan, one more favor, one more chance. Kristen, her eyes positively glinting whenever she admired my company's balance sheets like a connoisseur examining fine wine. They'd planned this, hadn't they? Whilst I lay in that hospital bed fighting for each breath, they'd buried me in their minds, perhaps in their hearts, certainly in the public consciousness. For what? Money. My company. The house. The thought burned through me, a slow, searing rage that steadied my shaking hands. I looked back at Marjorie, her face pale with shock. "Where's St. Luke's from here?" I asked, though I knew the way perfectly well. Sometimes one needs to hear directions, simply to anchor oneself in reality. "Down Elm Street, 10 minutes walk," she said softly. "Ronald, are you sure you're—" "I'm sure." I cut her off, my voice hard as Yorkshire granite. The streets of Hartford unfolded before me like a particularly well-maintained stage set, complete with cobblestones and blooming magnolia trees that seemed almost too perfect to be real. My legs ached with each step, a persistent reminder of the coma's theft of my strength. But I pressed forward, driven by a fury that burned hotter than the May sun. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and coffee from a corner cafe, but it couldn't mask the bitterness that had settled in my throat like a particularly unpleasant medicine. Mark, my son, my own blood, had declared me deceased. And Kristen, with her manicured nails and sharper ambition, had helped him orchestrate this macabre performance. Why? The question gnawed at me like a particularly persistent terrier as I walked toward St. Luke's. Elm Street was unnaturally quiet, the sort of quiet that amplifies every sound. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a motor car, the toll of church bells calling me closer like some sort of ecclesiastical siren song. I passed the cafe where I used to buy Mark his Sunday lattes during those more innocent times, when he still bothered to show up for family occasions. The memory stung like a paper cut. Him at 16, all elbows and dreams, promising to make me proud. I'd bought him his first car, a rather tired Vauxhall, and watched him grin as he reversed into the neighbor's hedge on his inaugural drive. I paid for his university education, his various business ventures, his spectacular failures, and now, apparently, his memorial service for me. My fingers curled into fists, the cracked watch on my wrist ticking away like a countdown to something I couldn't quite identify. A gentleman in a tweed cap shuffled past, his eyes widening as he caught sight of my face. "Ronald Turner," he muttered, half to himself, then hurried away with the sort of urgency usually reserved for avoiding charity collectors or door-to-door salesmen. I froze, my pulse quickening. Did the entire town think I was some sort of supernatural apparition? The thought was rather unsettling, but it also fueled my determination. The church's steeple was visible now above the trees, its doors tall and arched, looming in my mind like the entrance to some sort of theatrical venue where the most important performance of my life was about to unfold. I crossed a small park, The very same one where I'd pushed Mark on the swings when he was small enough to think his father hung the moon. Another unbidden memory safest, Mark at 25, slouched in my office chair like a deflated balloon, asking for yet another loan. "Just seed money, Dad," he'd said, his eyes avoiding mine with the sort of shifty behavior that would have made a used car salesman blush. "I've got a plan." I'd written the check, ignoring that little voice in my head that sounded remarkably like common sense. Months later, I discovered he'd blown the lot on a sports car and a rather extravagant holiday to Las Vegas with Kristen. I'd forgiven him, naturally. What else does a father do? But this, declaring me dead, this was betrayal carved deep enough to leave permanent scars. The bells tolled again, louder now, the sound vibrating in my chest like some sort of acoustic defibrillator. I rounded the corner, and St. Luke's came into view, its stone walls glowing in the afternoon light like something from a particularly well-funded period drama. Potted flowers lined the steps, their petals scattered on the cobblestone like confetti from the world's most inappropriate celebration. My breath hitched, not from exertion, but from the sheer audacity of what lay ahead. I thought of Kristen, her voice dripping honey as she'd once admired my house, my company, my entire existence. "You've built something quite special, Ronald," she'd said, her eyes calculating values with the precision of a particularly avaricious accountant. I'd brushed it off at the time, but now I saw it for what it was: greed dressed up in designer clothing and social niceties. The heavy oak doors of St. Luke's groaned as I shoved them open, the sound cutting through the gentle murmur of voices like a particularly dramatic thunderclap. The air inside was thick with incense and melted wax, whilst flickering candles cast shadows on the Gothic stained glass windows that would have impressed even the most discerning vampire. Rows of pews stretched before me, filled with faces I'd known for years, neighbors, colleagues, old friends, all frozen mid-hymn like participants in some sort of ecclesiastical statue game, their eyes wide as they took in my rather theatrical entrance. My silhouette loomed against the spring sunlight streaming through the open doors, and I allowed the moment to hang in the air like a perfectly timed dramatic pause. "You're celebrating a bit early, aren't you?" I announced, my voice ringing out with all the authority of a seasoned thespian delivering his most important soliloquy. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were rather satisfying, I must admit. A woman in a particularly dramatic black had clutched her chest as though auditioning for a Victorian melodrama, whispering ghost to her husband with the sort of theatrical horror that would have made Sarah Bernhardt proud. An elderly couple near the back stumbled toward the aisle, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor like a percussion section having a nervous breakdown. I stood my ground, my gaze locked on the front pew where Mark and Kristen sat like guilty defendants in the dock. Their heads snapped toward me with the synchronized precision of well-trained dancers, though considerably less graceful. Mark's face drained of color faster than water from a punctured bucket, his mouth half open as though words had simply abandoned him in his moment of greatest need. Kristen's hand tightened on her handbag, her knuckles white as fresh snow, her usually perfect makeup doing precious little to hide the naked panic in her eyes. The hymn books trembled in people's hands like autumn leaves, whilst the candles along the altar flickered as a draft swept through the open doors behind me. Rather fitting symbolism for the lie I'd just thoroughly demolished. I took a step forward, my shoes scuffing the polished floor with the satisfaction of chalk on a blackboard. The pain in my chest had vanished entirely, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in months. "Thought I was dead, did you?" I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the church like a particularly effective public address system. "Funny how quickly you've moved on." The crowd shifted and muttered like a disturbed beehive. Mark lurched to his feet, his tie askew, and hurried down the aisle toward me with all the grace of a startled day. "Dad," he hissed, his voice a cocktail of fear and fury, "what are you doing here?" He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in like particularly aggressive talons, but I shook him off with surprising ease. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his jaw twitched like a faulty electrical connection. Guilty as a fox in a henhouse, the poor lad. "Dad," I repeated, loud enough for the front rows to hear every syllable. "You don't get to call me that. Not after this theatrical performance." I gestured toward the church, the flowers, the framed photograph of myself on the altar, smiling and oblivious, taken from last Christmas when I still believed in the basic decency of family. "You buried me, Mark. You and her." I nodded toward Kristen, who hadn't moved from her pew, her gaze darting about like a trapped animal seeking an exit. Mark's voice dropped to a pleading whisper. "Dad, you don't understand. It was a mistake. We thought." "A mistake?" I cut him off, my voice rising like a tide of righteous indignation. 2 months in a coma, and you couldn't be bothered to visit even once. But you found time to plan this elaborate farewell performance. I swept my arm toward the pews, the mourners, the entire charade. What was it, Mark? The company, the house, my bank accounts. The whispers grew louder, a tide of shock and judgment washing over the congregation. Kristen finally stood, smoothing her dress with hands that shook like earthquake victims, and started toward us, her heels clicking on the stone floor like an approaching storm. "Ronald, please," she said, her voice syrupy but strained, like honey mixed with broken glass. "This isn't the place for such discussions. Let's talk outside." I laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls like a particularly unpleasant bird call. "Oh, we'll talk, Kristen, but not on your terms. Not anymore." I turned back to Mark, my voice steady as Yorkshire stone. "I gave you everything. Your car, your education, your countless second chances. And this is how you repay me." Mark's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to me, calculating damage like an accountant during tax season. "You're making a scene," he muttered, his hand hovering near my elbow with the hesitancy of someone approaching a potentially explosive device. "Let's go, shall we?" I stepped back, well out of his reach. "No, you don't get to control this narrative. Not anymore." My gaze swept the church, taking in the stunned faces, the half-melted candles, the open doors still swaying slightly in the breeze. The truth was out, raw and ugly as a winter morning, and I felt it settle into me like a foundation stone. This was merely the opening act. The pub smelled of hops and old timber, the sort of establishment where Hartford's locals gathered to drown their sorrows in amber comfort and quiet conversation. I sat at a corner table, the folder from Frank unopened before me, its edges worn from my restless fingers like a worry stone. The pint I'd ordered sat untouched, beads of condensation pooling on the scarred tabletop like tears for opportunities missed. A crack ran along the wall beside me, jagged as the fault line running through my family. I'd come here after my dramatic church appearance, needing somewhere to think without the whispers and stares that seemed to follow me like particularly persistent shadows. Mark's face, pale and sweating like a guilty schoolboy, flashed through my mind, and I gripped the table's edge to steady the rage that threatened to spill over like an overfilled kettle. The door creaked, admitting Frank in all his rumpled, gray-suited glory, his eyes heavy with the burden of unpleasant news. He spotted me immediately and slid into the chair opposite with the weary sigh of a man who'd seen too much of humanity's darker impulses. "You look like something the cat dragged in," he observed with his characteristic bluntness, setting a thick manila folder on the table with the sort of thud that speaks of serious business. "Didn't sleep," I replied, my voice low and gravelly. "What have you discovered?" Frank leaned forward, his fingers drumming the folder like a nervous pianist. "Are you quite certain you want to delve into this now? After the performance you put on at St. Luke's, half the town's tongues are wagging like excitable spaniels." "Let them wag," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Show me what you found." He exhaled slowly, flipping open the folder with the reverence usually reserved for handling ancient manuscripts. Papers spilled out like accusations, legal forms, signatures, official stamps that looked far too legitimate to be anything but authentic forgeries. "This," he said, sliding a document toward me with the care of someone handling a particularly venomous snake, "is a death certificate. Yours, dated a month ago." My name stared back at me in crisp black ink, Ronald James Turner, deceased. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from weakness, but from a fury I could barely contain, like steam building in a pressure cooker. "They forged it," I stated, though it wasn't really a question. The words tasted like ash and betrayal. Frank nodded grimly. "Mark filed it with the county. Kristen hired herself a lawyer, some slick operator from London, to expedite the paperwork. They've been working with the efficiency of a military operation. Ronald, your company's already on the market, complete with interested buyers queuing up like bargain hunters at a closing down sale." I set the certificate down, my fingers curling into fists. My company, 30 years of sweat, sleepless nights, and deals sealed with nothing but handshakes and mutual trust, reduced to nothing more than a payday for my son and his scheming wife. I thought of Kristen's voice at the church, smooth as silk and twice as deceptive, urging me to rest, to be reasonable. I thought of Mark's clammy palms and his lies crumbling under the weight of my very inconvenient existence. They planned this entire charade whilst I lay unconscious, my life hanging by the thinnest of threads. How did they manage it? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. Frank rubbed his jaw, glancing around the pub where the barman was polishing glasses with a sort of meditative focus that suggested he'd heard it all before. A couple laughed softly at the bar, blissfully unaware of the domestic drama unfolding mere meters away. They claimed the hospital had lost track of you, he explained, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. Told everyone you died in surgery with no visitors present. No one to contradict their version of events. Quite clever, really, diabolically so, but clever nonetheless. Frank leaned closer, producing another document from his folder of horrors. They also had your will modified. Naturally, everything flows directly to Mark now. I laughed, a bitter sound that drew a curious glance from the barman. My will. I left him the house, the savings, certainly, but never the company. That was supposed to be earned, not inherited like some sort of aristocratic birthright. Frank's expression grew even grimmer, if such a thing were possible. Ronald, you've got solid grounds to contest this. Fraud, forgery, theft, the whole criminal catalogue. But it's going to be messy. They've got access to your money now, and they've had a head start. You need to be strategic, not simply loud. Strategic. I rolled the word around like a wine taster considering a particularly complex vintage. Strategic meant planning, waiting, striking when they least expected it. I thought of Kristen's panicked eyes, Mark's trembling hands. They were sloppy in their fear, and fear makes people careless. What else is in that folder of revelations? I asked, nodding toward the remaining papers. He slid over another document, a contract bearing a buyer's name I didn't recognize. They are selling to a development company. Significant money. Expedited transaction. The closing scheduled for 2 weeks hence. His eyes met mine, steady but concerned. You've got time, Ronald, but not much of it. I stayed at the contract, the numbers blurring slightly. Millions. My life's work being sold off like a second-hand motor car. I remembered bringing Mark to the office as a child, letting him spin in my chair whilst promising him a future if he worked for it. Earned it. Deserved it. Now he'd simply taken it, with Kristen pulling the strings like some sort of avaricious puppeteer. What would you advise? I asked, not because I was lost, but because I needed to hear the path forming in my mind spoken aloud. Frank sighed deeply. Acquire proper legal representation. Not me. Someone more ruthless than my old bones can manage. File an injunction to freeze the sale immediately. Prove you're breathing, which after today's church performance shouldn't present much difficulty. He smirked faintly. But Ronald, do watch your back. They are desperate now, and you've thoroughly rattled their cage. I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of that damning death certificate. It felt flimsy, a lie made of paper and ink, but it had nearly succeeded in erasing me entirely. Nearly. The house felt different upon my return. Too quiet, oppressive in its silence, like a held breath that might never be released. I sat at the kitchen table, Frank's folder spread before me like a map of betrayal, each document a waypoint on the journey toward understanding just how thoroughly I'd been deceived. The old clock on the wall maintained its steady tick, counting seconds I'd nearly lost forever, its rhythm both comforting and mocking. The air carried the scent of dust and neglect, heavy curtains trapping shadows that seemed to whisper of better times. I ran my finger over the death certificate once more, my name printed there like a headstone inscription. Mark and Kristen had buried me on paper, and I felt the weight of that lie settling into my very bones. The house had become a stranger's dwelling, its corners hiding memories I wasn't quite ready to confront. Mark's childhood laughter, Kristen's practiced smiles at family dinners. Had it all been merely performance art? I thought of her, always watching with those calculating eyes, her gaze lingering on the company ledgers, the property deeds, the bank statements. She'd coveted this life. Not me. Certainly not Mark. And Mark, too weak to resist, had followed her lead like a sheep to slaughter. The silence became suffocating, driving me back into the spring evening. I grabbed the folder and my jacket, stepping into the night air where Hartford's streets hummed with life. Cricket songs, distant traffic, the rustle of blooming trees creating nature's own symphony. The pub wasn't far, that same establishment where I'd met with Frank, its neon sign buzzing like an electric beacon. I needed noise, people, somewhere to think without the ghosts of my past whispering accusations in my ear. I pushed through the door, greeted by the familiar cocktail of beer and fried food. The establishment was half full, locals hunched over their drinks like conspirators plotting minor rebellions. I settled at my previous table, the folder safely beside me, and accepted the coffee a waitress delivered. Black, steaming, grounding. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a woman at the bar. 50-ish, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind sensible spectacles, her fingers dancing across a laptop keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist. She glanced up, caught my gaze, and offered a small nod of recognition, though I couldn't place her face. She closed her laptop with purpose and approached, her boots soft against the wooden floor. "Ronald Turner, isn't it?" Her voice carried warmth tinged with professional curiosity. "I'm Elaine Harper, Hartford Chronicle. I heard about your rather dramatic entrance at St. Luke's today." I raised an eyebrow, sipping my coffee. News travels with remarkable speed in this town. She smiled, settling into the chair opposite without invitation but not unwelcome. "Small community, significant story. Might I ask what actually happened?" Her tone was casual, but her gaze was sharp, like a detective who'd spotted an inconsistency in a suspect's statement. I could see she'd noticed the folder beneath my arm, sensed the weight it carried. Trust had become a luxury I could ill afford after Mark and Kristen's betrayal. But Elaine's eyes held no pity, no judgment, merely a hunger for truth that I found rather refreshing. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "My son and his wife attempted to bury me. Quite literally. They forged my death certificate to sell my company whilst I was unconscious." Her eyebrows lifted, but she didn't flinch, a woman who'd clearly heard her share of extraordinary tales. "That's rather more than a family disagreement," she observed, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "You have proof, I assume." I patted the folder, sufficient to begin unraveling their deception. Elaine leaned closer, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "I've been investigating some rather questionable business dealings around town recently. Your son's name appeared in my notes, along with Kristen's. They are not nearly as clever as they believe themselves to be." She paused, studying me with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient text. "I could assist you, Ronald. I know people, understand how to access records, ways to expose this situation without you bearing the entire burden alone." I sat back, weighing her offer. A journalist, risky, certainly, but potentially exactly what the situation required. Someone to illuminate Mark and Kristen's lies, to make them squirm under public scrutiny. "Why help me?" I asked bluntly. "What's your interest in this affair?" She shrugged, a wry smile playing at her lips. "A compelling story. Justice served. Take your pick." She reached into her bag, producing a business card and sliding it across the table like a calling card in a drawing room drama. "Consider the offer, but don't deliberate too long. People like them rarely stop at one deception." I took the card, her name printed in crisp, authoritative letters. Elaine Harper, senior reporter. I thought of Frank's warning about being strategic rather than simply loud. Elaine could represent the intelligent approach, the ally I hadn't expected but desperately needed. Her hand brushed the folder as she stood, a small gesture heavy with promise. "Ring me," she said, then headed back to the bar, leaving me with my coffee and something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. I departed the pub with the night air cool against my face, Elaine's card secure in my pocket, her words echoing in my mind. Expose them. The folder felt lighter now, its contents transformed from wounds into weapons. Back in my kitchen, I placed the card beside the telephone. Frank needed to hear about this development, to know I wasn't navigating these treacherous waters alone anymore. I lifted the receiver, my fingers steady as stone, and began to dial. Frank's office occupied the second floor of a Hartford brownstone, cramped quarters redolent of stale coffee and printer ink where he'd practiced law for the better part of 4 decades. I pushed through the glass door, the folder of evidence heavy beneath my arm, Its papers creased from my grip like battle-tested documents. My steps carried more confidence than they had in weeks, each one fueled by purpose that drowned out the persistent ache in my joints. The receptionist, a young woman with her hair scraped into a severe bun, glanced up and gestured toward Frank's office without ceremony. Time, after all, had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Frank occupied his position behind a desk that resembled a paper mountain range, stacks of documents teetering like miniature legal monuments. A solitary lamp cast warm light, catching dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts in the air. He looked up as I entered, spectacles sliding down his nose with the inevitability of age. "You A-League Ronald," he observed, gesturing toward the familiar worn leather chair. "That's rather unprecedented." His tone carried lightness, but his eyes remained serious, already scanning the folder as I deposited it with appropriate gravity. "No point in delay," I replied, settling into the creaking chair. "They've enjoyed quite enough advantage already." Frank opened the folder with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts, his fingers navigating through the forged death certificate, the sale contracts, the altered will. A low whistle escaped him, the sort of sound a man makes when confronted with professional audacity. "This represents a considerable mess," he admitted. "But it's our mess now. We can file an injunction to freeze the company sale immediately. Proving your continued existence, which you've already accomplished rather dramatically, should cause the entire house of cards to collapse with satisfying thoroughness." He produced a legal form, crisp and official as a government proclamation. "Sign this, and I'll have it at the courthouse before noon strikes." I accepted the pen he offered, its weight grounding me to the moment. The nib scratched against paper with the sound of justice being written into existence, each stroke reclaiming what had been stolen from me. My company, built from nothing but determination and late nights, constructed through handshakes and mutual respect rather than legal documents and corporate maneuvering. I thought of Mark's perpetually lazy grin whenever he'd requested yet another favor, another loan, another second chance. Kristen's eyes had always gleamed when she'd examined my ledgers, calculating wealth with the precision of a particularly avaricious accountant. They'd attempted to steal everything I'd built. My hand remained steady throughout, the signature bold and final, Ronald J. Turner. Not deceased. Not defeated. Very much alive and considerably displeased. Frank gathered the papers like a general collecting battle plans, tucking them into his briefcase with military efficiency. "This will strike them rather hard, Ronald. But they won't surrender quietly. Mark has access to your funds now, and Kristen possesses ambition enough for 10 ordinary people. Prepare yourself for significant resistance." "Let them resist," I replied, my voice carrying the chill of a Yorkshire winter. "They initiated this conflict. I fully intend to conclude it." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his weathered features. "That's the Ronald I remember. Simply avoid anything rash. We're engaged in chess here, not drafts." Chess. I could manage chess. I constructed my business by outmaneuvering competitors, reading people's intentions, understanding precisely when to advance and when to exercise patience. Mark had grown sloppy in his panic, whilst Kristen's paranoia made her predictable. I'd exploit those weaknesses, transformed them into strategic advantages. The folder rested between us, its contents now ammunition rather than evidence of injury. Documents, Frank had termed them. To my mind, they represented justice itself, inked and legally binding. My telephone buzzed, the screen illuminating with Mark's name like an unwelcome beacon. I studied it whilst my pulse quickened with anticipation rather than anxiety. Frank raised an inquisitive eyebrow. "Will you be answering that particular summons?" "Might as well hear what the boy has to say for himself," I replied, accepting the call and holding the device to my ear with the casual confidence of a man holding all the proper cards. "What do you want, Mark?" His voice crackled through, sharp and unsteady as a nervous tenor. "What the devil are you doing, Dad? Freezing the sale? You're destroying everything we've worked toward." The panic was raw, unfiltered, and it sent grim satisfaction coursing through me like expensive brandy. "Destroying everything," I echoed, my tone remaining calm and cutting. "You buried me, Mark. Forged my death certificate. Attempted to sell my company whilst I lay unconscious. You haven't the slightest right to discuss destruction." He sputtered like a defective motorcar, words colliding with each other in his haste. "It wasn't like that. We thought you were gone. We were simply trying to save it, I snapped, my voice sharp as a whip crack. You made your choice, my lad. Now live with the consequences. I terminated the call before he could offer additional excuses. The silence that followed both heavy and sweet. His fear served as proof that I'd struck first and struck effectively. Frank observed me with an unreadable expression. Feel better now? Not yet, I admitted, rising to my feet. But I shall. I tucked the folder beneath my arm once more, its weight saving as a reminder of the battle ahead. Inform me the moment that injunction's filed. He nodded, already reaching for his telephone. You'll hear from me before evening falls. The pub hummed with the comfortable chaos of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, the air thick with the aroma of fried potatoes and spilled bay. I occupied my usual corner booth, the wooden table bearing decades of careless hands and countless stories, whilst my telephone glowed in the dim light like a harbinger of modern unpleasantness. Kristen's social media post stared up at me with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer wrapped in silk. Our family is heartbroken. Ronald's health has been fragile since his accident, and his recent behavior shows he's not himself. We ask for privacy as we care for him during this difficult time. A parade of sad-faced emoji followed, whilst the comments piled up like digital condolences. Poor Kristen, read one. He must be quite delusional, proclaimed another with the confidence of someone who'd never met me but felt qualified to diagnose my mental state from a Facebook post. My fingers tightened around the phone until the plastic protested. They were painting me as unhinged, a sick old man lashing out at his loving family with the unreasonable fury of someone whose mind had clearly gone walkabout. Clever, cruel, thoroughly modern in its calculated malice. I set the device face down on the scarred wood, my jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. The pub's noise faded to background static as I processed Kristen's maneuver. She wasn't merely defending herself. She was launching a counterattack, attempting to discredit me before I could expose the full scope of their deception. Mark might have panicked like a startled rabbit, but Kristen remained calculating as a chess grandmaster. Her words served as digital slander, designed to bury me once more in public opinion if not in actual fact. I leaned back against the booth's vinyl upholstery, allowing my anger to crystallize into something sharper, more useful. She'd made an error. This post wasn't strength. It was desperation masquerading as sympathy. The door swung open with its characteristic creak, admitting Elaine with her laptop bag slung over one shoulder, her hair slightly mussed from the spring breeze. She spotted me immediately and slid into the booth with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. I see you've discovered Kristen's little performance, she observed, her voice carrying the dry amusement of someone who'd witnessed this particular play before. Her eyes flicked to my overturned phone. She's practically begging for sympathy. Rather pathetic, really. Pathetic, perhaps, but potentially effective, I replied, sliding the device toward her. She's attempting to turn the entire town against me, make me appear mentally unstable. Elaine skimmed the post, her initial smirk fading into something more predatory. This is precisely what panic looks like, Ronald. She's thoroughly frightened. You froze their sale, appeared at the memorial service like Banquo's ghost. She recognizes that control is slipping through her manicured fingers. She opened her laptop with practiced efficiency, the screen casting pale light across her determined features. I've been conducting additional research. Mark engaged a solicitor, some overpriced hotshot from London. They are filing to contest your injunction, claiming you lack the mental capacity to manage your own affairs. I produced a bitter laugh that wouldn't have been out of place in a Dickens novel. Mental capacity. I constructed that company from absolutely nothing whilst Mark was squandering my money on motorcars and continental holidays. Precisely, Elaine agreed, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with the efficiency of a court stenographer. Their case rests on foundations of sand. Forged documents rarely survive judicial scrutiny, particularly when the allegedly deceased party is wondering about very much alive and considerably irritated. She pulled up a file on her screen. But they are gambling on public sentiment. Kristen's post represents step one in their strategy. Paint you as the villain whilst casting themselves as long-suffering victims. I stared at the phone, Kristen's words glowing like accusations in the darkness. Another document of sorts, as false as the death certificate but potentially more damaging to public perception. What would you suggest as our response? I asked, leaning forward with interest. Elaine's eyes positively gleamed with the light of impending battle. We respond, but more intelligently than they have. I maintain contacts within your company, employees who've witnessed Mark's management style firsthand. They are decidedly unimpressed with his performance. She paused, her voice softening with something approaching sympathy. You're not navigating this alone, Ronald. People recognize truth when they encounter it, and they are not particularly fond of being deceived. I nodded, feeling the weight in my chest ease slightly. Elaine represented more than an ally. She was a lifeline, her confidence as infectious as her determination. I thought of Mark's trembling voice during our telephone conversation, Kristen's calculated tears at the memorial service. They were scrambling like rats abandoning a sinking vessel, and I held the upper hand. For the moment, anyway. How quickly can we speak with these employees? I inquired. Tomorrow morning, she replied, closing her laptop with satisfying finality. Meet me at my house. 9 o'clock sharp. Bring that folder of yours. She stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder with the purposeful movement of someone accustomed to action. Get some rest, Ronald. You'll require your strength for what's coming. I managed something approaching a smile. Grim, perhaps, but genuine. Rest is rather overrated at my age. I watched her departure, the pub's noise swelling around me like a tide of ordinary life continuing regardless of my extraordinary circumstances. The phone lay on the table, Kristen's post still glowing with its digital poison, but I flipped it face down and rose to my feet. The spring night waited beyond the door, Hartford streets quiet beneath a canopy of stars. I stepped outside, cool air brushing my face like a benediction, and began walking toward home. Tomorrow, Elaine and I would strike again. I could sense it in the air. The tide was turning, and truth was clawing its way toward the light. Elaine's house proved to be a charming Victorian cottage perched on Hartford's edge, its porch sagging beneath the cheerful weight of potted plants and accumulated time. I knocked with purpose, the folder of documents secured beneath my arm, its edges now smooth from constant handling like a talisman worn by frequent use. The door opened to reveal Elaine's welcoming smile, spectacles perched atop her nose with scholarly precision. Come in, Ronald. Coffee's brewing. The interior carried the comfortable scent of roasted beans and well-loved books, a warm contrast to the crisp May morning beyond. Her sitting room embraced organized chaos, shelves stuffed with novels like old friends, a tabby cat curled contentedly on a sun-warmed cushion, and a worn oak table that had clearly witnessed countless conversations and conspiracies. We settled at the table, paper spread between us like a military campaign map. Elaine's notebook lay open, her pen already scratching notes as she outlined our strategy with the precision of a general planning battle. A newspaper article exposing Mark and Kristen's fraud, supported by irrefutable evidence and witness testimony. I deposited the folder with appropriate gravity, its contents, forged certificates, contracts, witness statements, representing an ever-growing arsenal of truth. These documents felt different now. Not wounds, but keys. Keys to unlock the justice I'd been systematically denied. Elaine sipped her coffee contemplatively. We have the legal foundation with Frank's assistance, she observed, voice steady as bedrock. But this article will strike them where it truly hurts, their carefully constructed reputation. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Kristen has built her entire existence upon appearances, social standing, perceived respectability. We dismantle that facade, and she crumbles like a house built on sand. Her eyes met mine with the intensity of shared purpose. Are you prepared to engage in rather unsavory tactics? I nodded, a faint smile playing at my lips, considerably more unsavory than their methods, if necessary. I thought of Kristen's social media post, her lies glowing accusingly on my phone screen the previous evening. She'd attempted to bury me beneath public opinion, but Elaine was absolutely correct. Reputation represented her greatest vulnerability, and we'd exploit it mercilessly. We began with a telephone call to Joe, my company foreman who'd remained loyal throughout 2 decades of shared labor and mutual respect. Elaine activated the speaker function, and Joe's gravelly voice filled the room like the sound of honest work made audible. Mark appeared a month ago, he reported, his tone heavy with barely contained disgust. Announced you were gone, claimed he was assuming control, wanted me to authorize some sale documents. I refused point blank, didn't feel right. You understand. I leaned forward, hands clenching involuntarily. You didn't sign anything. Absolutely not, Joe replied with Yorkshire bluntness. Told him precisely where he could shove his paperwork. Several others did likewise. We recognized something wasn't quite right about the whole business. His voice softened with genuine concern. Delighted you're back, boss. We need you more than ever. The words struck deeper than I'd anticipated, a reminder of the loyalty Mark had betrayed so casually. I glanced at Elaine, who was scribbling notes with journalistic fury, her pen flying across the page. Thank you, Joe, I managed, voice steady despite the knot in my chest. We'll set this right. After disconnecting, Elaine grinned with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd spotted her quarry. That testimony is pure gold, Ronald. Combined with your documents, it paints an unmistakable picture of fraud and coercion. She produced another letter from the folder, one I hadn't previously noticed, bearing letterhead from a prestigious London law firm. I discovered this in my research. Mark's solicitor sent it to your company's board, pressuring them to approve the sale with indecent haste. Rather sloppy of them. It's practically a signed confession. I examined the letter, its crisp paper yielding beneath my fingers. Another document, another nail in the metaphorical coffin. How did you acquire this particular piece of evidence? Elaine winked with mischievous satisfaction. I maintain certain professional relationships, people who occasionally owe me favors. Let's simply say I have my methods. She leaned back in her chair, coffee mug now empty. This article is materializing beautifully. We have Joe's testimony, this solicitor's letter, Frank's injunction, one additional witness, and we'll be ready for publication. I felt something stirring within me. Not merely hope, but certainty. Elaine wasn't simply an ally. She'd become a genuine partner in this endeavor. Her warmth and intelligence were drawing me back from the darkness that had threatened to consume me entirely. I thought of Mark's trembling voice during our confrontation, Kristen's panicked social media performance. They were unraveling like cheap knitwear, whilst we were constructing something solid and unshakable. You're remarkably skilled at this type of work, I observed, the compliment emerging unexpectedly. She laughed, a sound like silver bells in the quiet room. Years of chasing stories, Ronald. Truth is a way of revealing itself to those persistent enough to seek it. You're not entirely hopeless yourself at this detective business. Her cat leaped onto the table with feline grace, nudging my hand for attention. I scratched behind its ears, the simple normalcy grounding me in a way I hadn't experienced in weeks. We continued working as afternoon stretched toward evening, the lamp's glow steady as hours accumulated. Elaine drafted the article's opening paragraphs, reading selected passages aloud. Sharp, damning, absolutely truthful. I contributed details, memories of my company's earliest days, the sweat and pride that Mark had never bothered to understand or appreciate. The folder expanded steadily. Joe's statement joined by notes from additional employees, including a secretary who'd overheard Kristen's telephone conversations with potential buyers. Each word represented another brick in the wall we were constructing. Solid, unshakable, built to last. As midnight approached, Elaine stifled a yawn and closed her notebook with satisfying finality. We'll conclude this tomorrow morning. I'll have it on my editor's desk by noon, published the day following. She stretched, working out the kinks from hours of concentrated effort. Go home, Ronald. You've earned some rest. I gathered the folder, its familiar weight now comforting rather than burdensome. I'm not entirely certain I remember what rest feels like anymore, I admitted, but smiled genuinely, the first authentic smile in weeks. Stepping onto her porch, I gazed upward at Hartford's star-dotted night sky, breathing in air that tasted of possibility rather than betrayal. The article was nearly complete, truth finally approaching the light. I began my walk home, Elaine's words echoing, one more day, and Mark and Kristen would face the consequences of their deception. I was thoroughly ready. The newspaper lay folded on my doorstep like a gift from the gods of justice, its edges damp with morning dew that seemed to bless the printed words within. I bent to retrieve it, fingers brushing the rough paper whilst inhaling the sharp scent of fresh ink. The perfume of truth finally told. The headline screamed in bold black letters, "Local businessman betrayed. Son and daughter-in-law exposed in fraud scandal." Elaine's byline sat beneath like a badge of journalistic honor, and my heart thudded not with anxiety but with quiet triumph. This was the moment. The instant when Mark and Kristen's carefully constructed lies would crumble before all of Hartford like a house of cards in a hurricane. I carried the paper inside, floorboards creaking their familiar morning song beneath my feet. The kitchen remained dim, shadows dancing whilst the old clock maintained its steady rhythm. Time reclaimed, justice served. I spread the newspaper across the table like a battle standard, ink smudging my fingertips as I read Elaine's masterpiece. She'd woven a damning narrative with the skill of a seasoned prosecutor. The forged death certificate, Mark's coercion of employees, Kristen's secret negotiations with buyers. Joe's testimony appeared raw and honest, alongside that incriminating solicitor's letter. Each word a knife thrust into their credibility. Every sentence represented a brick in the wall we'd constructed, solid and unyielding as Yorkshire stone. I leaned back in my chair, a smile tugging at my lips like sunrise after the longest night. They'd attempted to bury me. Instead, they'd buried themselves beneath the weight of their own deception. Donning my jacket, I stepped into the spring morning with the newspaper tucked securely beneath my arm. Hartford buzzed with seasonal life, dogwoods blooming like white promises, children cycling down Elm Street with the carefree joy of youth, air sweet with lilac and possibility. At the corner cafe, clusters of locals huddled over their own copies, voices carrying the urgent undertone of scandal discovered and justice contemplated. "Can you credit it?" one woman muttered, spectacles sliding down her nose as she examined the damning text. That Kristen, acting the grieving widow whilst planning grand theft. And for what? Money she'd never earned. Her companion shook her head with the righteous indignation of the thoroughly deceived. Poor Ronald. Imagine waking up to discover your own family had robbed you blind. Our eyes met across the cafe's window, and she nodded, a small gesture carrying enormous respect. I returned the acknowledgement, chest swelling with vindication long denied. Further along at the flower shop, Mrs. Carney stood behind her counter arranging roses with the practiced care of someone who understood beauty's temporary nature. She spotted me approaching and waved me inside, her smile wide as summer sunshine. "Ronald Turner," she exclaimed, wiping soil from her hands with characteristic efficiency. "You're a sight for these old eyes. Read that article this morning. Showed them properly, didn't you?" She reached across the counter, squeezing my arm with the fierce affection of someone who'd witnessed too much injustice in her lifetime. "Always knew you possessed more backbone than they credited. Proud of you, dear boy." "Thank you, Mrs. Carney," I replied, voice steady but warm. Her words settled into me like balm on ancient wounds. Departing the shop, I felt the newspaper's weight differently now. Not burden but vindication, a document of truth finally acknowledged. I discovered Elaine in the park, seated on our UL bench beneath a budding magnolia, her own copy spread across her lap like a trophy. She glanced up as I approached, grinned sharp with satisfaction. "Well, if it isn't Hartford's own resurrection story," she teased, folding the paper with theatrical precision. "Have you witnessed the reaction out there? The town's consuming this with the enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas pudding." I settled beside her, bench cool against my legs. Couldn't have missed it. Mrs. Carney practically offered to organize a parade in my honor. Elaine's eyes sparkled with professional pride. "Heard from my editor this morning. The story's spreading beyond Hartford. Even the London papers are expressing interest. Mark and Kristen are finished, Ronald. Socially, legally, completely." The word finished carried final weight, but I'd learned not to underestimate people like Mark and Kristen. Cornered animals often proved most dangerous. "They'll attempt something desperate," I observed, tone calm but certain. "They always do when their backs are against the wall." "Let them try," Elaine replied, her grin fierce as a winter gale. "We possess truth and half the town supporting you. Their moves are exhausted, their credibility destroyed." She stood, brushing petals from her coat with the satisfaction of someone who'd completed important work. "Come along, let's celebrate properly. Coffee and victory, two of life's greatest pleasures." I followed her through the park, alive with birdsong and gentle breezes. Hartford felt transformed today. Not merely backdrop but witness, its streets carrying our story like gospel truth finally revealed. We passed a newsstand where the article's headline blazoned across every available copy, and I experienced a surge of pride encompassing not just personal vindication but recognition of everyone who'd supported truth over convenience. The newspaper had transcended May paper and ink. It had become proof itself, a document of justice finally served. A reckoning long overdue but worth every moment's wait.